Some armies won with numbers. Some won with weapons. Some won with technology. These 36 units won with something none of those things can fully explain. One of them was made entirely of inflatable tanks and fake radio signals, and it worked better than most real armies ever did. One in 1944, the United States Army created a unit whose entire purpose was to be fake. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Ghost Army, was a 1,100-man deception force assigned to impersonate entire divisions of up to 30,000 soldiers. They carried inflatable tanks that could be set up by 2 men in minutes. They broadcast fake radio transmissions in the voices of officers they had studied. They played recorded sounds of tank columns and troop movements through speakers powerful enough to be heard 15 miles away. They dressed as generals and drove conspicuously through towns to spread misinformation. They fooled German intelligence repeatedly, pinning down forces that outnumbered them 100 to 1. Their existence was classified until 1996. The men who served in it included fashion designers, artists, and actors. They won battles without firing a shot. The Germans spent real resources chasing an army made of rubber and recordings. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae were not the interesting part of the Spartan story. The system that produced them was. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were removed from their families and entered the Agog, a state-run program of physical hardship, combat, training, and deliberate deprivation designed to produce soldiers who found civilian life uncomfortable. They were taught to steal food and punished not for stealing, but for getting caught. They slept on reeds they cut themselves. They fought each other constantly. By the time a Spartan male completed the Agog at 30, he had spent 23 years being systematically transformed into something that barely resembled the men armies around him were made of. The 300 at Thermopylae held for 3 days, not because they were brave. Bravery implies a choice. They held because the idea of doing anything else had been trained out of them before they were old enough to understand what was being done. The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, spent 191 days in continuous combat during World War I, more than any other American unit. They were black soldiers who were denied the right to fight alongside white American troops, so they were attached to the French army instead and fought under French command. They never lost a man to capture. They never surrendered a foot of ground. France awarded them the Croix de Guerre collectively, their highest military honor. When they returned to New York, they were given a parade up Fifth Avenue. Then America went back to segregation, and the Hellfighters went back to being invisible. Their most decorated soldier, Henry Johnson, fought off a 24-man German raiding party alone with a bolo knife, and waited 97 years for the United States to give him the Medal of Honor he had earned that night. France had known what they were worth the entire time. America took nearly a century to agree. The Gurkhas are Nepalese warriors who have served the British Army since 1816, and whose reputation has done as much damage to enemies as their kukri knives. Their legend began during the Anglo-Nepalese War, when British officers, after fighting against them, recommended recruiting them rather than continuing to fight them. That recommendation has never been reconsidered. German soldiers in World War II were reported to abandon positions when they learned Gurkhas were operating in the area. Japanese commanders in Burma documented a specific fear of Gurkha night operations. A Gurkha soldier named Lashaman Groom held off 200 Japanese attackers alone through a single night after losing his hand to a grenade, killing 31 men with his remaining hand. When asked what motivated such action, Gurkha soldiers have consistently given answers that translate roughly as it seemed like the right thing to do. That combination, devastating capability delivered with complete understatement, is what has made their reputation impossible to exaggerate. The Persian Immortals were the elite infantry corps of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a force of exactly 10,000 soldiers that maintained its number with a precision designed to function as psychological warfare before a single blow was landed. When a soldier was killed, wounded, or fell ill, he was replaced immediately, so that the unit never appeared to have taken casualties. To an enemy watching the Persian army advance, the Immortals simply never shrank. They carried spears, bows, and wicker shields, wore elaborate, embroidered robes over their armor, and were accompanied by personal servants and covered carriages for their wives and concubines on campaign. They were simultaneously the most terrifying and the most comfortable soldiers in the ancient world. At Thermopylae, they suffered significant casualties. Against the Spartans, they outnumbered catastrophically. The number stayed at 10,000. It always stayed at 10,000. That was the point. The 1st Special Service Force, known as the Devil's Brigade, was a joint American-Canadian Special Operations Unit formed in 1942 and trained in Montana for mountain warfare and ski operations. Their original mission, destroying Norwegian power plants, was cancelled before they deployed. What they became instead was something German commanders in Italy described in intelligence reports as a particularly aggressive and terrifying unit whose methods were not consistent with conventional military behavior. They conducted night raids so frequently and so silently that German soldiers began calling them the Black Devils. They left notes on the bodies of German soldiers they killed, warning that the brigade was coming for the rest of them. Captured German soldiers consistently expressed disbelief at how few men the brigade actually consisted of, having assumed from the scale of the damage that they were fighting a force many times larger. They were never defeated in combat. They were disbanded in 1944, having accomplished everything they were given, and several things they were not. 7. The Mongol Tumans were not just a military formation. They were an administrative and logistical system so precisely engineered that it could project organized violence across distances that no army before or since has matched at the same speed. A Tumen was a unit of 10,000 cavalry organized in decimal subdivisions, down to groups of 10 men, each level commanded by an officer accountable for the performance of every man under him. Every soldier maintained 3 to 5 horses, allowing the army to cover up to 100 miles a day by rotating mounts. They communicated through a relay system that could transmit messages across the empire faster than any contemporary technology allowed. They used psychological warfare systematically. Cities that surrendered were spared, cities that resisted were destroyed completely, and the news was allowed to travel ahead of the army. By the time the Mongols arrived at many cities, the walls were already opening. The largest contiguous land empire in history was built less by the Mongols fighting than by the world deciding not to make them. 8. The French Foreign Legion was founded in 1831 with a single unusual premise: that a man's past was irrelevant to his future service. Anyone could enlist regardless of nationality, criminal record, or personal history. Upon enlistment, a legionnaire received a new name and a new identity. The French state did not ask and did not want to know. What it wanted was soldiers willing to fight in places and under conditions that French citizens could not be ordered into without political consequences. The Legion has fought in every French conflict since its founding, in Africa, Asia, and Europe, in conditions that have killed enormous percentages of its strength without affecting its ability to recruit. Its dropout rate during basic training is among the highest of any military unit in the world. Those who complete it are bound to the Legion by an institutional culture so total that former legionnaires consistently describe it as the only family that ever accepted them without conditions. The Legion does not produce soldiers. It produces something that does not have a precise civilian translation. 9. The Janissaries were the elite infantry corps of the Ottoman Empire, created in the 14th century through a system called devshirme, the periodic collection of young boys from Christian families in the Balkans, who were then converted to Islam, given a rigorous education, and trained from childhood as soldiers belonging entirely to the Sultan. They could not marry during their active service. They could not engage in trade. They owed everything, their identity, their religion, their purpose, to the Ottoman state, which made them simultaneously the most loyal and the most dangerous force in the empire. When they were loyal, they were unbeatable. When they were not, they were the most effective kingmakers in Ottoman history, deposing sultans who displeased them with a regularity that made the position of sultan considerably less comfortable than it appeared from the outside. They were eventually destroyed by Sultan Mahmud II in 1826 in an event called the Auspicious Incident, which was the Ottoman government's way of describing the massacre of its own elite military corps in the streets of Istanbul. 10. The British Special Air Service was founded in 1941 by a Scottish officer named David Stirling, who submitted a memo to Middle East Command arguing that small teams of highly trained soldiers operating behind enemy lines could achieve results disproportionate to their size. The memo was approved largely because Stirling delivered it personally after sneaking into headquarters past the guards to bypass the chain of command that would have rejected it. The SAS spent World War II destroying Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa, blowing up supply lines, and conducting raids that forced Germany to divert significant forces to rear area security. After the war, the unit was disbanded and reformed, conducting operations in Malaya, Oman, the Falklands, and Iraq that have never been fully declassified. Every modern Special Forces unit in the world, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Australian SASR, was either directly modeled on the SAS or heavily influenced by its doctrine. Stirling's memo changed how armies think about what a small number of exceptional soldiers can do. 11. The Viet Cong sappers were the demolition and infiltration specialists of the North Vietnamese war effort. trained to penetrate American and South Vietnamese military bases that were protected by multiple perimeter layers, guard towers, motion sensors, and barbed wire. They did it repeatedly and almost routinely. Sapper units conducted extensive reconnaissance over weeks or months, memorizing guard rotations, identifying gaps in sensor coverage, and mapping the interior layouts of bases through informants and bossy. On the night of an operation, they moved through perimeters so slowly, sometimes inches per hour, that motion sensors failed to register them as anything but background noise. They reached the interior of supposedly impenetrable installations, destroyed aircraft, ammunition dumps, and command facilities, and disappeared back through the perimeter before the base fully understood what was happening. American commanders who reviewed Sapper after-action reports began questioning the reliability of every security system they had. The Sappers did not have better technology than the Americans. They had more patience. The Knights Templar were founded in 1119 AD to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, and within 2 centuries had become the most powerful financial institution in medieval Europe. The connection between warrior monks and banking was not accidental. Pilgrims needed to transport wealth to the Holy Land without carrying gold that could be stolen en route. The Templars invented the letter of credit. A pilgrim deposited gold in Paris, received a document, and withdrew an equivalent amount in Jerusalem. The system required an international network of Templar houses that functioned as the first multinational bank. Kings borrowed from the Templars. Entire wars were financed through Templar credit. The warrior monks who protected pilgrims on the road were simultaneously running the medieval equivalent of an international financial system. They were destroyed in 1307 when the French King Philip IV, deeply in debt to the order, had the leadership arrested on charges of heresy and extracted confessions under torture. He cancelled his debt by burning the people he owed it to. The German stormtroopers of World War I were not the Nazi paramilitary organization. They were something more consequential. The elite infiltration units of the Imperial German Army that in 1917 and 1918 developed the assault tactics that every special forces unit in the world still uses today. Instead of advancing in lines across open ground into machine gun fire, as both sides had been doing for 3 years, stormtrooper units were trained to bypass strong points, infiltrate gaps, attack command posts and artillery, and create chaos in the enemy rear before the main force advanced. They moved in small groups using covering fire and terrain for concealment. They carried light weapons, submachine guns, grenades, flamethrowers, designed for close combat in confined ground. The tactics worked so effectively in the spring offensive of 1918 that they nearly broke the Allied line. Germany lost the war before the doctrine could be fully exploited. The Allies studied it carefully afterward and built their special forces around what they had found. The Roman legions were not primarily a fighting force. They were an administrative system that happened to be extremely good at fighting. A legion of approximately 5,000 men was a self-contained unit capable of building its own fortifications, roads, bridges, and supply infrastructure while simultaneously defeating armies that outnumbered it. Roman soldiers were engineers first and fighters second. Every legion carried the tools and skills to construct a fortified camp at the end of every day's march, creating a defensible position that eliminated the possibility of being caught unprepared. The tactical formations, the manipular system, and later the cohort system, allowed the legion to adapt its frontage and depth to almost any terrain and enemy type. Legions that were destroyed were reconstituted. Legions that were victorious were not dissolved. The same institutional knowledge, the same drills, the same engineering standards persisted across centuries. Rome did not maintain an empire for 500 years by winning battles. It maintained it by making the cost of challenging it consistently higher than the cost of accepting it. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers, was formed in 1981 after the failed Iranian hostage rescue operation exposed catastrophic deficiencies in American Special Operations helicopter capability. Their motto is "Death waits in the dark," which describes both their operational preference and their attitude toward the work. Night Stalker pilots fly at extremely low altitude, in complete darkness, using night vision systems, into landing zones that conventional military aviation would refuse. They have supported every major American Special Operations mission since their formation: Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, including the 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden, during which a Night Stalker helicopter suffered a mechanical failure and crashed inside the compound without aborting the mission. The pilots trained for years on the specific aircraft and conditions of that raid. One of their helicopters was left behind in Abbottabad. The Pakistani government photographed the wreckage. Military analysts around the world studied the photographs, trying to determine what they were looking at. The Night Stalkers have never officially confirmed what happened that night. 16 Shaka Zulu did not inherit a military tradition. He built one from scratch, and it was so effective that it conquered southern Africa in under a decade. His core innovation was the replacement of the throwing spear with a short stabbing assegai designed for close combat, combined with a large cowhide shield that could hook an opponent's shield aside to expose his body. He drilled his warriors to cover 50 miles a day on foot without sandals, toughening their feet deliberately. He developed the chest and horns formation, a central force that engaged the enemy frontally, while two flanking forces encircled them simultaneously. He trained his warriors to run, not walk, into battle. He executed commanders who retreated without orders. The Zulu army he built did not defeat opponents. It absorbed them, retrained them in Zulu methods, and expanded. When the British Empire finally confronted the Zulus at Isandlwana in 1879, it was destroyed so completely that the British government initially refused to believe the casualty reports. 17 The OSS Jedburgh teams were among the most audacious small unit operations of World War II. Three-man teams consisting of one American, one British, and one French officer parachuted behind enemy lines in occupied France to organize, arm, and direct local resistance movements against German forces. Each team carried radio equipment, weapons, and the authority to request supply drops of weapons and explosives for the resistance fighters they were organizing. A three-man team operating in a region could coordinate the activities of hundreds of resistance fighters, disrupt German supply lines, blow bridges, derail trains, and report on German troop movements. Force multiplication on a scale that bore no relationship to the size of the unit achieving it. 93 Jedburgh teams operated in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands between 1944 and 1945. Several were captured and executed. Those that survived frequently organized resistance forces that tied down German divisions that were needed elsewhere. 3 men with a radio changed. 18 The Macedonian phalanx was not invented by Alexander the Great. It was inherited from his father Philip II and refined into the tactical system that conquered Persia, Egypt, and the edges of India in 13 years. The formation's core weapon was the sarissa, a pike between 15 and 21 feet long that required 2 hands to operate and created a wall of overlapping spear points that cavalry and infantry alike found almost impossible to penetrate from the front. A phalanx 16 men deep presented the points of the first 5 ranks to any attacker, while the rear ranks held their sarissas at angles that deflected incoming missiles. The weakness was the flanks and rear. The formation was nearly impenetrable from the front and almost helpless when surrounded. Alexander's tactical shetibir was the cavalry hammer that protected the phalanx's flanks, while it acted as the anvil that fixed enemy formations in place. The combination was undefeated until Alexander died, and the generals who inherited it began fighting each other. 19 The Soviet Union's female sniper program during World War II produced over 2,000 confirmed kills from approximately 2,000 trained female snipers, a ratio that represents some of the most effective individual combat performance in the history of the conflict. The most decorated was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who accumulated 309 confirmed kills before being wounded and withdrawn from frontline duty. She was sent to the United States on a goodwill tour, where Eleanor Roosevelt personally hosted her, and American journalists asked her what brand of makeup she wore in the field. She told a Chicago audience she was not yet 25, but had already eliminated 309 fascist occupants. The audience fell silent. The Soviet female snipers operated under conditions, lying motionless in snow and mud for hours, sometimes days, that male commanders initially doubted women could endure. The results required no defense. German forces specifically targeted Soviet snipers for counter-sniper operations, which meant the women who survived long enough to accumulate significant kill counts had also survived being hunted. 20 The Varangian Guard was the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, formed in 988 AD from Norse warriors sent by the Kievan Rus as part of a diplomatic arrangement with Emperor Basil II. The cultural mismatch was extraordinary. Scandinavian axe-bearing pagans and recent converts guarding the most sophisticated Christian monarchy in the medieval world, surrounded by Greek bureaucrats and Orthodox clergy in a palace of extraordinary opulence. The Varangians were chosen precisely because they had no political loyalty to Byzantine factions. They were outsiders who served the emperor personally, rather than any Byzantine noble house that might want to replace him. They were paid extremely well and allowed to loot the emperor's chambers upon his death, a rite called the pollutusvarf, which gave them a financial incentive to keep the emperor alive as long as possible. Harold Hardrada, who later invaded England in 1066 and was defeated at Stamford Bridge 3 weeks before Hastings, served in the Varangian Guard earlier in his career. The most famous Viking in English history learned his trade guarding a Greek emperor in Constantinople. 21. The Kedan is the direct action and assassination unit of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, whose existence Israel did not officially acknowledge for decades, and whose operations have reshaped the geopolitics of the Middle East in ways that can be traced but never officially confirmed. After the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre of Israeli athletes, the Kedan was activated as part of Operation Wrath of God, a years-long campaign to locate and kill every person involved in the planning and execution of the attack. The operation ran for over 20 years. Most of the targets died. The methods varied: letter bombs, booby-trapped telephones, close-range shooting in European cities, and the Israeli government has never officially confirmed any of it happened. The Kedan has also been credited with the assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, Hamas military commanders, and Hezbollah leadership figures. Each death changed something. None of them were officially acknowledged. The most consequential military unit in the Middle East is one whose operations exist only in the gap between what happened and what anyone will admit. 22. The English longbowmen, at Agincourt in 1415, did not just win a battle. They ended a military era. The mounted French knight had dominated European warfare for centuries, representing an enormous investment in horses, armor, training, and equipment that only the nobility could afford. At Agincourt, an outnumbered English army facing a French force several times its size positioned its longbowmen on flanks, protected by sharpened stakes, and waited. When the French cavalry charged across muddy ground, the arrows came at a rate of 10 to 12 per minute per archer. The horses fell. The knights fell behind them. The knights who reached the English line were exhausted, encased in armor that made standing up from the mud nearly impossible, and were killed by English foot soldiers with hatchets and knives. The battle that should have been a French victory by sheer weight of numbers became a catastrophic French defeat. The longbowmen who achieved it were English peasants who had been required by law to practice their weapon every Sunday. Parliament had mandated the training. The knights who died at Agincourt had not taken the law seriously enough. 23. The Long Range Desert Group was a British Special Operations Unit formed in 1940 that spent years operating behind Axis lines in the North African desert, conducting reconnaissance so precise and sustained that it fundamentally compromised Rommel's ability to secure his supply lines. They drove modified trucks deep into the Sahara, living for weeks without resupply, observing and recording every vehicle that moved along Axis supply routes, and transmitting the information to Allied command. Their road watches, teams positioned beside Axis supply routes for days at a time, counting and classifying every vehicle, gave Allied planners a more accurate picture of Rommel's logistical situation than his own rear area commanders sometimes had. They also conducted raids, inserted SAS teams, and rescued downed Allied airmen across thousands of miles of desert. They were not the most glamorous special operations unit of the war. They were arguably the most consistently useful, providing the intelligence infrastructure without which the SAS raids and the broader desert campaign would have operated in darkness. 24. The Swiss pikemen of the 14th and 15th centuries accomplished something that military theorists had considered structurally impossible. They made heavy cavalry irrelevant on the European battlefield, using nothing but disciplined foot soldiers and very long sticks. Swiss cantons fielded infantry, formed in dense pike squares that could march at a pace that shocked contemporary observers and fight in formations that heavy cavalry charges could not penetrate. At Morgarten in 1315, Swiss infantry destroyed an Austrian cavalry force so comprehensively that it rewrote European assumptions about what foot soldiers could do against mounted knights. They became the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe, fighting for whoever paid them, maintaining a professional neutrality that has survived in a different form to the present day. The Vatican's Swiss Guard, the ceremonial unit that still protects the Pope, is a direct descendant of the mercenary tradition that began with farmers in alpine valleys deciding that disciplined foot soldiers with pikes were worth more than any knight on horseback. 25. Delta Force, officially the first Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, was established in 1977 by Colonel Charles Beckwith after he spent time with the British SAS and returned to the United States convinced that America needed an equivalent. The unit's existence was not officially acknowledged by the U.S. government until 2003, 26 years after its formation. Its operations in that period existed only in classified documents and the accounts of people who were legally prohibited from discussing them. What is confirmed represents a fraction of what the unit has actually done. operations in Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and an unknown number of countries where American Special Operations Forces have never been officially deployed. The unit's selection process eliminates the vast majority of candidates, including experienced Special Forces soldiers, before training even begins. The soldiers who complete selection and training are not publicly identified. Their operations are not publicly confirmed. Delta Force exists in the space between what the American military does and what the American government admits it does, which is a space considerably larger than most people assume. 26. The Rajput warriors were the military aristocracy of medieval India. A warrior caste whose code of honor, Rajput Dharma, produced fighters for whom death in battle was preferable to surrender or retreat under any circumstances. When a Rajput fortress faced inevitable defeat, the women performed jauhar, mass self-immolation to avoid capture, while the men performed Shaka, putting on saffron robes and riding out to die fighting rather than surrender. The practice was not occasional. It was systematic and documented across centuries of Rajput military history. Mughal commanders who besieged Rajput fortresses routinely found that the most difficult part of a campaign was not breaching the walls but extracting any military or political benefit from a victory when the defeated side refused to survive it. The Rajputs produced some of the most effective cavalry in South Asian military history. They also produced a military culture so rigidly committed to a specific concept of honorable death that it occasionally prevented the strategic flexibility that might have allowed them to survive as a political force. 27. The Chindits were Brigadier Ord Wingate's Deep Penetration Special Forces unit that operated behind Japanese lines in Burma in 1943 and 1944, under conditions so extreme that the debate about whether the operations were worth the cost began while they were still happening. The first Chindit operation inserted 3,000 men into Japanese-held territory and extracted 2,182 of them, a 30% attrition rate that would have ended most units. The second operation was larger and more ambitious, inserting over 20,000 men by glider and parachute into the Burmese jungle to establish fortified strongholds that could disrupt Japanese supply lines and tie down forces needed elsewhere. The operations achieved their strategic objectives. They also destroyed the health of most of the men who participated in them. The jungle conditions, disease, and extreme physical demands left survivors with long-term health consequences that persisted for decades. Wingate died in a plane crash during the second operation. The debate about whether what he built was genius or organized destruction has never been fully resolved, which is itself a kind of answer. 28. The Spanish tercios were the dominant military formation in European warfare from approximately 1530 to 1680. A combined arms system that integrated pikemen, swordsmen, and arquebusiers into a single tactical unit capable of both offensive assault and defensive stability in a way that no contemporary formation could match. A tercio of approximately 3,000 men could protect its own gunners with pikes, while its gunners provided firepower that made pike-only formations vulnerable. And its swordsmen could exploit gaps that neither pike nor shot could penetrate alone. The system was not invincible, but it was consistently better than its alternatives for a century and a half, which in military history is an almost unprecedented duration of tactical dominance. Spanish tercios fought in Italy, the Netherlands, North Africa, and the Americas, maintaining a professional corps of experienced soldiers that gave the formation institutional knowledge that conscript armies could not replicate. They were eventually defeated not by a superior tactical system, but by economic exhaustion. Spain ran out of money to pay them before anyone found a reliable way to beat them. 29. The Harlem Hellfighters appear here again, because the second half of their story is different from the first. When they came home from France in 1919, they marched up Fifth Avenue to enormous crowds. Then the celebration ended. The veterans who had spent 191 days in continuous combat returned to a country where they could be lynched for wearing their uniforms in the wrong state. The summer of 1919 became known as the Red Summer, a period of race riots and racial violence across American cities in which black veterans who had fought for American democracy were attacked by white mobs for demanding it. Several Hellfighter veterans were killed. None of their attackers were prosecuted. The French government had given them medals. The American government gave them Jim Crow. Henry Johnson, who had fought off 24 Germans alone with a knife, came home to find that his wounds had left him unable to work, that the army denied he had been wounded at all, and that there was no system to support him. He died broke in 1929. The Medal of Honor he earned that night in the Argonne Forest arrived in 2015. His family received it. 30. The Cossack cavalry were the irregular mounted warriors of the Ukrainian and Russian steppes who served as the Russian Empire's most effective frontier force for 3 centuries, combining the riding skills of steppe nomads with a ferocity in close combat that regular cavalry units found difficult to replicate or counter. They were not a regular military formation. They were autonomous communities of warriors who maintained their own traditions, elected their own leaders, and negotiated the terms of their service with whoever was paying them. Their effectiveness came from a childhood spent on horseback, in an environment that produced natural riders, combined with combat experience accumulated across generations of frontier warfare against Ottoman forces, Polish armies, and internal Russian rivals. Napoleon's veterans who encountered Cossack cavalry during the retreat from Moscow described them in terms that made clear they were not dealing with conventional cavalry. They did not charge and break through. They swarmed, withdrew, pursued, and wore down. They were everywhere and nowhere. And the Grande Armée that froze on the road to Moscow was harassed every step of the way by men who considered this weather unremarkable. 31. The British Commandos of World War II were formed in 1940 after the fall of France, when Winston Churchill demanded the creation of a force capable of striking the European coastline and making the Germans feel that nowhere was safe. What followed was a series of raids that ranged from the brilliantly executed to the catastrophically costly, but which achieved a strategic objective beyond the raids themselves. They forced Germany to station significant forces along thousands of miles of European coastline to defend against attacks that might come anywhere at any time. The commando raid on the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire in 1942 destroyed the only dock on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the German battleship Tirpitz, effectively neutralizing the ship as a strategic threat without ever sinking it. The raid on Bruneval captured a German radar installation and brought it back to England for analysis, accelerating Allied electronic warfare development by months. The commandos lost men on every operation. The Germans spent the rest of the war guarding a coastline because of what those men had shown was possible. 32. Hannibal's war elephants, at the Battle of Trebia in 218 BC, represented something Roman legions had no doctrine for. A weapon that was simultaneously a physical force capable of trampling infantry and a psychological weapon capable of breaking formations that had never encountered anything like them. Horses were terrified of elephants. Formations of infantry that held against cavalry charges broke when elephants appeared among them. Hannibal used them on his flanks to anchor his line and prevent the Roman cavalry from rolling up his infantry, and the combination produced a catastrophic Roman defeat. Rome eventually found answers, driving the elephants with noise and fire, targeting the mahouts who controlled them, creating gaps in formations to let them pass through harmlessly. But the process of finding those answers cost significant Roman casualties. Carthage's war elephants were a finite resource. They could not be easily replaced in the field, and their logistical demands were enormous. Hannibal used them brilliantly until he ran out of them. Then he was brilliant without them. He lost eventually anyway, but not because of the elephants. 33. The ninja of feudal Japan were not the black-clad acrobatic assassins of popular culture. They were something more interesting and considerably more useful. Covert intelligence operatives who specialized in infiltration, information gathering, sabotage, and occasionally assassination, operating in a military culture where direct combat was the only form of warfare considered honorable. Ninja, practitioners of ninjutsu, operated in the gaps that the samurai code refused to enter. They gathered information on enemy castle layouts, troop strengths, and supply routes. They started fires inside fortifications. They spread disinformation. They assassinated targets when direct military action would be too costly. The black outfit of popular imagination was a theatrical convention. Actual ninja in field operations used disguise to infiltrate as merchants, monks, farmers, or entertainers. Their most powerful weapon was not a shuriken. It was the ability to be in a place without anyone understanding what they were. The romanticized version of their story has made them famous. The accurate version makes them considerably more significant. 34. The Prussian Grenadiers of Frederick the Great were the product of a military philosophy that treated drill precision not as ceremony, but as tactical technology. Frederick understood that an infantry unit that could reload, advance, and fire on command with mechanical regularity in conditions of extreme stress, smoke, noise, men falling beside them, would defeat an equal or larger force that could not maintain that discipline under the same conditions. Prussian infantry were drilled until the sequence of loading and firing a musket became reflexive, something the body did without the mind's involvement, regardless of what was happening around it. They could fire 5 volleys per minute while advancing, a rate that no contemporary army matched. The psychological effect of a Prussian infantry line advancing in perfect order while maintaining that rate of fire broke formations not primarily through casualties, but through the conviction that what was coming toward them could not be stopped. Frederick won battles with discipline before his soldiers fired a shot. The grenadiers were the most visible expression of a military system that made human behavior as predictable as machinery. 35. The Ottoman Sipahi were the feudal cavalry of the Ottoman Empire, who between the 14th and 17th centuries represented the finest heavy cavalry in the Mediterranean world, and formed the core of the military force that destroyed the Crusader states, conquered Constantinople, and drove deep into Europe. Each Sipahi held a land grant called a timar, in exchange for military service, arriving for campaign with their own horses, armor, and equipment at their own expense. A self-financing military system that gave the Ottoman state an enormous cavalry force without a standing army budget. They were trained from youth in horsemanship and combat, fighting with composite bows from horseback, and transitioning to lance and sword for close combat. At the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, they destroyed the Kingdom of Hungary in less than 2 hours of fighting. European commanders who faced Ottoman cavalry in the field reported that the combination of archery, mobility, and close combat capability was unlike anything they had encountered in European warfare. They were eventually rendered obsolete by gunpowder infantry, the same trajectory that ended every cavalry tradition in every army in the world. 36. The Ghost Army returns here because it deserves the final word. Every unit in this video won through some combination of training, discipline, technology, courage, or numbers. The Ghost Army won through imagination. They understood something that the other 35 units on this list demonstrated without articulating. That what an enemy believes is happening is often more decisive than what is actually happening. The Mongols used it with deliberate psychological warfare. The ninja used it with disguise. The Gurkhas used their reputation. The Ghost Army built a system around the principle and operated it as a military unit. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, recorded sound of armored columns. Actors playing generals. The enemy's intelligence picture was the battlefield, and the Ghost Army fought on it with tools that weighed almost nothing and cost almost nothing and moved entire German divisions. The soldiers who served in it were artists, designers, and performers who had been handed uniforms and told to pretend to be an army. They were better at it than most armies are at being real. You just watched 36 units that changed what war means. Some of them you had heard of. Most of them you had not. All of them rewrote the rules that everyone else was following. Subscribe because the next video goes deeper into the history that never made it into your textbook. And drop in the comments which unit you would have wanted to serve in, because that answer says something about you.